My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old, and today I quietly signed my divorce papers at a luxury baby shower after discovering my husband was the father of my best friend's unborn twins. I did not scream or throw a fit when my mother-in-law shoved a $10,000 check against my chest as severance pay. I simply walked into the elevator and made a single phone call that would wipe out their entire financial existence by morning. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The baby shower was a masterclass in Manhattan extravagance. I had rented out a private rooftop garden overlooking Central Park, paying for the imported orchids, the catered caviar appetizers, and the live string quartet entirely out of my own pocket. I did this because the guest of honor was Brittany, a woman I had considered my closest confidant since our college days. She was glowing in a designer maternity dress, surrounded by 50 of our closest friends and colleagues celebrating the impending arrival of her twins. Everyone thought I was the ultimate supportive friend throwing this massive party to celebrate a single mother-to-be. My husband Preston was standing by the open bar laughing loudly with his finance buddies. At 35, Preston was a senior director at a prominent real estate investment trust. He loved expensive, tailored suits, flashy luxury watches, and reminding everyone that my job as a corporate risk assessor was incredibly boring. I always let him have his ego. He had absolutely no idea that my quiet desk job was actually a carefully constructed cover. In reality, I was the sole heir, an anonymous CEO of V Holdings, one of the most ruthless and powerful hedge funds on the East Coast. The afternoon sun was warm, so Brittany asked me to fetch her silk wrap from the coat check room inside the venue. I gladly obliged, happy to help my pregnant friend stay comfortable. As I picked up her expensive coat from the hanger, a piece of folded paper slipped from the side pocket and landed face up on the polished marble floor. I bent down to pick it up, assuming it was just a misplaced dry cleaning ticket or a parking receipt. It was a medical receipt for a premium private ultrasound clinic. I scanned the typed lines of text. The patient name listed at the top was Brittany, but the payer name listed at the bottom caught my immediate attention. It was Preston. My husband had paid $10,000 for out-of-pocket VIP maternity care. Below the billing information was a secondary note confirming the primary emergency contact as the biological father. The name printed there was Preston. I stood alone in the coat room for a long moment. The string quartet played a cheerful classical tune in the background, contrasting sharply with the total silence in my head. My husband and my best friend were having twins together. They had been carrying on an affair right under my nose, and I had just paid a small fortune to host their lavish celebration. I did not cry. My intense corporate training kicked in immediately. You do not mourn a bad investment. You cut your losses and you liquidate it. I walked back into the main event space, holding the crumpled receipt firmly in my hand. Preston was standing near the center of the room, holding a glass of vintage champagne and soaking in the attention of his peers. I walked straight up to him and handed him the piece of paper. He took it, read the top line, and his smug smile completely vanished. For a split second, I saw genuine panic flash in his eyes. Then he looked over at Brittany, who had walked over to join us. Instead of apologizing or pulling me aside to explain, Preston did the exact opposite. He signaled the string quartet to stop playing. The sudden awkward silence drew the attention of all 50 guests. Preston took a microphone from the event staff and wrapped his free arm tightly around Brittany's waist. He looked at me with absolute contempt and spoke directly into the microphone. "There is no point in hiding this anymore. Brittany is giving me the legacy you could not provide. We are having twins." The room erupted in shocked gasps and hushed whispers. Preston continued, his voice echoing across the silent rooftop. "You have been holding me back for years, Vanessa. You care more about your boring spreadsheets than building a family. I need the penthouse for my real family now. Pack your bags tonight and leave the keys on the counter." I stood perfectly still, letting the public humiliation wash over me without showing a single ounce of weakness. Brittany looked down, playing the role of the fragile victim, but I caught the corner of her mouth twitching upward in a triumphant smirk. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken the boring risk assessor. Before I could even respond, my mother-in-law, Sylvia, pushed her way to the front of the stunned crowd. At 60 years old, Sylvia considered herself Manhattan royalty, despite the fact that her family's wealth was built on massive piles of debt. She despised me because she believed I was a middle-class nobody dragging down her son's elite social status. She dug into her oversized designer purse and pulled out a folded document along with a cashier's check. She shoved the papers forcefully against my chest. It was a pre-printed divorce agreement already signed by Preston in blue ink. Attached to the front page was a check for $10,000. "Take the severance pay, dear," Sylvia sneered, pitching her voice loudly enough for the entire front row of guests to hear. "My son needs a strong bloodline to carry on our family name. He does not need a sterile calculator dragging down his potential. Take the money, call a taxi, and leave these two to celebrate their beautiful new family in peace." The cruelty in her voice was calculated, designed to break me in front of my peers and force me into submission. She fully expected me to burst into tears and run away in shame. Instead, I calmly took the divorce papers from her hand. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out my heavy Mont Blanc pen. Without a single tear or a word of protest, I flipped to the final signature page and signed my name on the dotted line. I handed the legal document back to Sylvia, who looked momentarily confused by my lack of emotion. Then I let the $10,000 check flutter from my fingers, watching it land directly on Preston's expensive leather shoes. "Keep the change," I said, my voice incredibly steady and ice cold. "You are going to need it to buy diapers." I turned my back on my husband, my former best friend, and my cruel mother-in-law. I walked straight through the crowd of stunned guests, keeping my head held high and my posture perfect. I did not look back once as I exited the beautiful rooftop garden and pressed the button for the elevator. The elevator doors slid open and I stepped inside the empty cabin. As soon as the heavy metal doors closed completely, blocking out the sound of their celebration, I pulled out my phone. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed a secure, unlisted corporate number. It was picked up on the first ring by the chief operating officer of V Holdings. "This is the CEO," I said, my tone completely void of emotion. "Initiate the liquidation protocol on the real estate investment trust where Preston works. Buy up their primary debt and trigger an immediate hostile margin call. I want their corporate credit lines choked to death by tomorrow morning." The voice on the other end simply replied, "Consider it done, ma'am." I hung up the phone and watched the floor numbers tick downward. Preston wanted to build a lasting legacy with my best friend. He was about to find out that the sterile calculator he just threw away owned the very ground he stood on. By noon the next day, my former penthouse had been completely taken over. Through my secure digital access to the building's management logs, I watched the gate codes transfer seamlessly to Brittany. They wasted absolutely no time playing the victorious couple. My social media monitoring team flagged their posts almost immediately. Brittany uploaded a painfully staged photo of her resting her hands on her baby bump standing on the balcony I had furnished. The caption read, "Finally home where we belong, out with the old in, with the true legacy." Preston commented with a diamond ring emoji, adding a remark about how a real man provides for a real woman. They were reveling in their perceived triumph, convinced they had successfully discarded a middle-class risk assessor who had simply gotten lucky with a good lease. But Brittany was not a woman who settled for just a view. She was a social climber who demanded immediate tangible proof of her elevated status. Within 48 hours, the credit alerts I had secretly tethered to Preston's accounts began flashing red. Brittany wanted a wardrobe overhaul at Cartier. She wanted a brand new customized Porsche SUV to safely transport the twins. Preston, blinded by his own arrogance and desperate to maintain the illusion of being a Wall Street titan, hit a wall. His standard corporate bonus was not going to cover $250,000 in sudden luxury spending. So he did exactly what I predicted an ego-driven, greedy man would do. He abused his position as a senior director at his real estate investment trust. Sitting in my minimalist glass-walled office on the top floor of a discreet Manhattan skyscraper, I watched the financial data flow across my monitors like an open book. V Holdings was not just a hedge fund. We were an apex predator in the distressed asset market, and I had built my entire empire on finding the weak points in bloated corporate structures. I took a sip of my black coffee and watched Preston's digital footprint light up my screen. He was initiating a massive, highly irregular internal loan from his own firm. He was using a loophole designed for executive real estate acquisitions to extract raw cash for Brittany's shopping spree. It was sloppy, desperate, and entirely unauthorized by his board of directors. I pressed the intercom button on my desk, connecting directly to my chief financial officer. "The bait has been taken," I said, keeping my voice flat and clinical. "Preston's firm is currently over-leveraged and relying on short-term mezzanine debt to stay afloat. I want you to activate our shadow company, Apex Solutions, buy up every single piece of primary debt holding his firm together. I do not care about the premium. I want total control of their credit lines by the end of the business day." My chief financial officer did not hesitate. Apex Solutions is fully capitalized and ready to execute the acquisition, he confirmed. "We will be their primary creditor before the stock market closes today." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the real-time transaction data begin to populate on my secondary monitor. Preston thought he was untouchable. He believed his title at the firm shielded him from consequence. But he was playing checkers while I owned the entire board. By purchasing his firm's debt through Apex Solutions, I was essentially becoming his ultimate boss. The firm would answer to me, and the very money he was trying to steal for his mistress was now being supplied by my own shadow company. However, corporate compliance is a tricky thing, even for an arrogant senior director. To pull a massive executive draw of that size, Preston needed to provide hard collateral. His firm's risk management software automatically flagged the loan requiring an asset of equal or greater value to secure the cash advance. I watched the live feed of the transaction stall, waiting to see how desperate my soon-to-be ex-husband truly was. Preston did not have the assets. His savings were negligible, constantly drained by his need to maintain an elite lifestyle. But his mother, Sylvia, had an asset. She owned a historic multi-million-dollar estate on the Upper East Side. It was the crown jewel of her socialite identity, the very foundation of the bloodline she bragged about at the baby shower. Through the secure back door I had installed in his firm's server months ago, I watched the digital paperwork compile. Preston uploaded a scanned copy of the deed to Sylvia's ancestral Manhattan estate. Then he did something so profoundly stupid, it almost made me smile. To bypass the lengthy legal approval process and secure the cash immediately for Brittany's new Porsche, Preston bypassed a notary. He digitally submitted a cross-collateralization agreement pledging his mother's home against his illegal corporate loan. At the bottom of the document, he uploaded a perfectly rendered, completely forged image of Sylvia's signature. I tapped my fingernail against my mahogany desk as the file dropped right into my secure server. In his desperate rush to buy the loyalty of a gold digger, Preston had just committed federal wire fraud and forged the signature of the mother who had helped him kick me out. He had literally handed me the keys to his mother's beloved estate. I downloaded the forged document, saved it to an encrypted flash drive, and calmly took another sip of my coffee. Preston had just mortgaged his entire family's legacy to Apex Solutions. He had no idea he had just sold his mother's house directly to me. The encrypted message appeared on my private phone just as the stock market closed for the day. It read, "Meet me at the vault in 30 minutes. Come alone." It was from Aisha, my former sister-in-law. Aisha was a brilliant corporate lawyer, a fierce African-American woman who had married Preston's older brother 5 years ago. From the moment she entered their family, Sylvia had treated her with thinly veiled disdain. I grabbed my coat and headed downtown, knowing that an urgent text from Aisha meant the carefully constructed walls of Preston's world were beginning to crack. The vault was a discreet, underground speakeasy in the financial district, the kind of place where high-powered executives went to conduct business away from prying eyes. I found Aisha sitting in a dimly lit corner booth, swirling a glass of neat bourbon. She was dressed impeccably, in a sharp burgundy suit projecting the absolute authority she commanded in the courtroom. I slid into the leather booth across from her and ordered a sparkling water. Aisha did not waste time with pleasantries. She set her glass down and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, calculating intensity. "You are well rid of him, Vanessa," she said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "Preston is a parasite, and that entire family is a sinking ship. I am just here to hand you the matches before it all burns to the ground." I took a sip of my water, letting her speak. Aisha had spent the last 5 years functioning as the unofficial legal fixer for Sylvia and her entitled sons. She had kept them out of lawsuits, negotiated their debt restructuring, and shielded their assets from their own sheer incompetence. In return, Sylvia constantly subjected Aisha to relentless passive-aggressive racism. Aisha recounted how just last week, Sylvia had hosted a charity luncheon and loudly introduced Aisha to a group of wealthy donors as her son's diversity hire. Sylvia would frequently compliment Aisha's natural hair by calling it surprisingly professional or suggest she must be so eternally grateful to have married into such a respectable established bloodline. Aisha had endured the toxic environment for the sake of her marriage, but Preston's latest stunt had crossed a legal and ethical line she absolutely refused to defend. "I know exactly why Preston hated your independence," Aisha continued, her gaze piercing through the dim light of the bar. "You never needed his money or his fake prestige. You were entirely self-sufficient, and that terrified a weak man like him. He needed someone fragile and easily manipulated, which is exactly why he chose your so-called best friend. Brittany is a social climbing parasite who will happily validate his delusions of grandeur as long as the credit cards keep clearing. But his arrogance is finally going to be his ruin, and I refuse to let my legal license go down with this family." She reached into her designer leather briefcase and pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive. She placed it deliberately on the mahogany table between us. I stared at the drive, already knowing what kind of heavy corporate ammunition a lawyer of her caliber could provide. "I oversee the legal risk compliance for the family's entire real estate portfolio," Aisha explained, her voice clinical and detached. "Preston thinks he is a financial genius, but he is incredibly sloppy. When he needed hard collateral to secure that massive internal loan for Brittany's sudden shopping spree, he tried to bypass my department's standard legal review. He thought he could hide his digital tracks by routing the approval through a dummy server late at night. He failed miserably." Aisha tapped the flash drive with her perfectly manicured fingernail. "I have the exact digital footprints, the IP logs, and the time-stamped keystrokes. This drive contains undeniable, irrefutable proof that Preston forged Sylvia's signature. He bypassed every single corporate safeguard and committed federal wire fraud to cross-collateralize Sylvia's historic Manhattan estate. He effectively stole his own mother's house to buy a luxury sports car for his mistress." I picked up the flash drive, feeling the cool metal against my palm. Aisha was handing me the exact legal weapon I needed to ensure Preston could never claim ignorance or shift the blame when the authorities inevitably came knocking. With this raw data, I did not just have financial leverage, I had the power to initiate a criminal investigation that would put him in a federal prison cell. "I am washing my hands of them," Aisha said, picking up her bourbon to finish the glass. "I have already drafted my formal resignation as their family counsel, and I am filing for divorce from his brother tomorrow morning. I am taking my assets and leaving them to drown in the toxic mess they created. Sylvia cares more about maintaining the illusion of old money wealth than she does about basic human decency. Let her see exactly what happens when the money dries up and the bill collectors come calling." I slipped the flash drive into the inside pocket of my blazer. "Thank you, Aisha. You have no idea how valuable this is to my current strategy." Aisha leaned back against the leather booth, a sharp, knowing smirk spreading across her elegant face. "Oh, I think I do." She crossed her arms, watching me closely. "Preston is an absolute fool. He was so desperate to secure the cash for his new high-rolling lifestyle that he did not even bother to research the entity buying up his corporate debt. He just blindly mortgaged Sylvia's entire estate to a shadow company called Apex Solutions. They are a ruthless corporate entity known in our circles for conducting aggressive hostile takeovers. The second he defaults on that loan, Apex is going to seize the estate and leave his mother completely homeless on the streets of New York. I held her gaze for a long moment. The low jazz music in the background seemed to fade away into total silence. I reached for my glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water before setting it back down on the coaster. I know I said my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of mercy. I own Apex. The morning after my meeting with Aisha, the sun rose over Manhattan, casting sharp shadows across the financial district. I sat in my office at V Holdings watching the digital clock on my terminal tick closer to 9. 50 blocks away, Preston was walking into the glass-walled lobby of his real estate investment trust, carrying a cup of artisan coffee and wearing a brand-new tailored suit. He had spent the entire weekend basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. According to the social media posts my team continued to monitor, he had taken Brittany out for a celebratory steak dinner, bragging loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear about his imminent promotion to partner. He truly believed he had beaten the system. He had secured the cash, bought his mistress her luxury car, and successfully discarded his boring wife without facing a single consequence. At precisely 10 in the morning, Preston's desk phone rang. It was the executive assistant to the firm's chief executive officer, instructing him to report to the main boardroom on the top floor immediately. Preston straightened his silk tie, shot a smug look at his subordinates in the bullpen, and confidently strode toward the elevators. In his mind, this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire career. He was absolutely convinced the board of directors had called a special session to reward him for his recent aggressive property acquisitions. He was blissfully unaware that he had funded those very acquisitions by illegally mortgaging his mother's ancestral home through a shadow corporation. He walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom, expecting thunderous applause, firm handshakes, and a lucrative new partnership contract that would solidify his status among the Manhattan elite. Instead, he was greeted by the sight of 7 incredibly wealthy men sweating profusely through their expensive custom dress shirts. The atmosphere in the room was heavy and suffocating. The chief executive, a severe man named Mr. Bradley, was pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his face pale and drawn. The chief financial officer was frantically typing on a laptop, completely ignoring Preston's arrival. Preston took his usual seat at the long mahogany table, flashing his signature arrogant smile, and casually asked if they were ready to discuss his quarterly performance review. Mr. Bradley stopped pacing and slammed his hands down on the polished conference table. He looked at Preston not with admiration, but with sheer terror. "There is no performance review," Mr. Bradley said, his voice shaking with barely contained panic. "We are in the middle of a catastrophic liquidity crisis. As of 8 o'clock this morning, our primary mezzanine debt lender sold our entire portfolio of corporate loans. We no longer owe the central bank. We owe a private, highly aggressive entity called Apex Solutions. And they just pulled the pin on a grenade." Preston's arrogant smile faltered, but he desperately tried to maintain his composure, playing the role of the seasoned finance expert. He confidently stated that debt transfers happen all the time in their industry and that they simply needed to negotiate new terms with Apex Solutions to extend their payment window. The chief financial officer slammed his laptop shut and glared at Preston with pure venom. "You do not understand the magnitude of this," the financial officer snapped. "Apex Solutions is not a standard corporate lender. They are a corporate executioner. They triggered a hostile margin call the second the transfer cleared. They are demanding immediate full repayment of our outstanding balances within 48 hours. If we do not wire the funds by Friday morning, they have the legal authority to seize our flagship properties and force this entire firm into immediate bankruptcy." Preston felt the color completely drain from his face. His own illegal, unauthorized internal loan, the money he stole to buy Brittany's Porsche and fund their lavish lifestyle, was tied directly to the firm's available credit. If the firm went bankrupt, an immediate federal audit would be triggered, exposing his wire fraud and forged collateral documents within hours. The board of directors did not know about his personal theft yet, but they knew Preston had a reputation for aggressive negotiation. Mr. Bradley pointed a trembling finger at Preston. You pride yourself on being our absolute best closer. You claim you can talk anyone into a deal. Prove it right now. I want you to call the head of Apex Solutions and buy us some time. Offer them a higher interest rate. Offer them equity. Offer them whatever they want. Just get them to call off the margin call before the market catches wind of this, and our stock plummets to absolute zero. Preston nodded quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was eager to prove his worth, but more importantly, he desperately needed to save the firm to protect his own criminal secrets. The chief financial officer slid a piece of heavy cardstock across the table, containing a single unlisted phone number. It was the direct line to the anonymous chief executive officer of Apex Solutions. Preston pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands visibly shaking as he dialed the number. He placed the phone perfectly in the center of the large conference table and activated the speakerphone function so the entire board of directors could hear his masterful negotiation skills at work. The line rang once. It rang twice. In my office across the city, I watched the incoming caller identification flash on my secure corporate line. I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly aligning my posture in my leather chair, and picked up the receiver. I did not offer a polite corporate greeting. I did not ask who was calling. I simply let the silence hang over the connection for a few agonizing seconds. In the boardroom, Preston leaned forward, clearing his throat, ready to deploy his most charming, persuasive tone. He opened his mouth to speak, preparing to introduce himself as the senior director of a prominent Manhattan firm, ready to beg for mercy from the faceless corporate titan holding his entire life and freedom in their hands. Before he could utter a single syllable, I spoke. My voice echoed loud and crystal clear through the high-definition speakers in the center of their silent boardroom. My tone was cold, clinical, and completely devoid of mercy. Your 48-hour margin call starts now, Preston. The silence in the boardroom after I spoke was absolute. I hung up my secure line, folded my hands on my mahogany desk, and went back to reviewing my spreadsheets. I knew Preston was currently trapped in a glass room surrounded by panicked executives, frantically trying to comprehend how the quiet, boring wife he discarded had suddenly become his corporate executioner. He was drowning in the realization that his entire career was tethered to a margin call he had no way of paying. But the universe has a fantastic sense of timing, and Preston's day was about to get significantly worse. Around 6:00 that evening, the sheer stress of the impending financial ruin must have radiated right through Preston and into his new domestic bliss. I received an automated alert on my private monitor, followed by a direct message from the private investigator I had hired to keep tabs on their movements. Brittany had gone into premature labor. Mount Sinai in Manhattan features a highly exclusive VIP maternity pavilion. It is specifically designed for celebrities, foreign royalty, and Wall Street titans who demand their children be born in the lap of absolute luxury. Brittany had bragged about securing a premium suite there on her social media weeks ago. The suite featured a private chef, Egyptian cotton linens, a dedicated concierge service, and a sweeping view of the city skyline. It also required a mandatory $50,000 deposit up front just to walk through the mahogany double doors. My investigator reported the scene exactly as it unfolded. Preston rushed a highly distressed Brittany into the pristine, quiet lobby of the VIP pavilion. Brittany was gripping the edges of the reception desk, breathing heavily through painful contractions, loudly demanding the staff prepare her luxury suite immediately. Preston, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of the unflappable executive, confidently pulled out his heavy metal corporate black card. He slid it across the marble counter to the receptionist, instructing her to put the entire $50,000 deposit on his company account. The receptionist, trained to cater to billionaires, swiped the card with a polite, polished smile. A sharp beep echoed in the quiet lobby. She frowned slightly and tried it again. Another sharp beep. She looked up, her customer service smile faltering, and informed Preston that the corporate card had been declined. Preston snatched the card back, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He muttered an excuse about an overly sensitive security flag and quickly pulled out his personal platinum credit card. He swiped it himself. Declined. He pulled out a second personal card, his breathing growing shallow. Declined. His hands began to shake violently. The reality of the morning's margin call was finally crashing down on his personal life. When Apex Solutions choked his firm's credit lines, the firm immediately suspended all executive corporate accounts to preserve liquidity. Furthermore, because Preston had linked his personal banking accounts to the fraudulent internal loan he took out to buy Brittany's new Porsche, the bank's automated fraud detection system had placed a hard freeze on his entire financial identity. He had zero liquidity. He could not even buy a cup of coffee in the hospital cafeteria. Brittany felt another severe contraction rip through her body. She looked at the flashing red declined message on the credit card terminal, and her fragile, delicate victim persona completely evaporated. Right there in the immaculate lobby of Mount Sinai, surrounded by elite medical staff and wealthy patrons, she started screaming at him. She demanded to know why a senior director on Wall Street could not afford to pay for his own children to be born. She called him a fraud, a useless liar, and a broke loser. Her voice echoed off the marble walls, making sure every single person in earshot knew exactly how humiliating this was for her. She had stolen a husband, expecting endless luxury, only to find herself standing at a reception desk with a man whose credit cards were entirely worthless. Preston was sweating profusely. His expensive tailored suit looked suddenly wrinkled, his ego shattered into jagged pieces on the hospital floor. The hospital staff politely but firmly informed him that without the mandatory deposit, they would have to transfer Brittany to the standard public maternity ward downstairs. The mere mention of the public ward made Brittany shriek with indignation. She ordered him to fix the situation instantly, or she would leave him the second the babies were delivered. Out of options, entirely stripped of his corporate armor and desperate to silence his screaming mistress, Preston pulled out his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the only person left in the world who might bail him out. He called his mother, Sylvia. He stepped away from the desk, whispering frantically into the receiver. He begged Sylvia to immediately wire $50,000 to the hospital, claiming there was a massive banking error with his accounts that would be sorted out by Monday. He pleaded with her to save the birth of her new grandchildren and protect the family's image from the embarrassment of a public ward. Preston stood in that lobby begging for a financial lifeline, completely unaware of the fatal trap he had already set for his own family. He demanded his mother open her checkbook, entirely oblivious to the fact that the forged signature he used to mortgage Sylvia's historic estate meant that her bank accounts were now permanently tied to his frozen assets. Across the city, Sylvia was standing in the opulent lobby of her private bank on the Upper East Side. She had rushed there immediately after Preston's panicked phone call, demanding the branch manager wire $50,000 to Mount Sinai. The branch manager, a man who usually greeted her with a warm smile and an offer of champagne, looked at his computer screen with genuine pity. He informed Sylvia that a hard freeze had been placed on all her liquid assets. An entity called Apex Solutions had triggered an immediate lien against her accounts due to a defaulted corporate loan secured by her residential estate. Sylvia felt the breath completely leave her lungs. She had absolutely no idea what Apex Solutions was, or what loan the manager was talking about. But she knew the society pages would have a field day if her new grandchildren were born in a public charity ward. Driven by pure panic and the desperate need to protect her family's wealthy image, Sylvia rushed back to her mansion. She opened her wall safe and pulled out her prized vintage diamond necklace. She took a cab to the Diamond District and swallowed her immense pride, pawning a precious family heirloom for a fraction of its worth just to secure a cashier's check for the hospital deposit. Thanks to Sylvia's humiliating sacrifice, Brittany was allowed to stay in the VIP maternity suite. 2 days later, she delivered healthy twins. However, the atmosphere in the recovery room was anything but joyous. Brittany complained endlessly about the stress Preston had put her through in the lobby, demanding he make it up to her with a massive diamond push present as soon as they got home. Preston just nodded, sweating through his shirt, as he obsessively refreshed the banking apps on his phone. Every single account still showed a zero available balance. He convinced himself it was just a massive corporate compliance error that he would easily fix on Monday morning. He just needed to get Brittany and the twins back to the penthouse so he could figure out a strategy. Since his ride-sharing apps were tied to his frozen credit cards, Preston had to beg Sylvia to send a hired car to bring them home. They arrived at the luxury high-rise exhausted and carrying two infant carriers. Preston guided Brittany to the private elevator, swiping his key fob with a heavy sigh. He promised her that once they were upstairs in their beautiful home, everything would go back to normal. The elevator chimed, and the heavy metal doors slid open directly into their private foyer. The illusion of safety shattered instantly. Instead of walking into a pristine, quiet penthouse, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. 5 burly private security guards dressed in tactical black suits were systematically clearing out the apartment. Preston watched in absolute horror as a guard grabbed armfuls of his custom-tailored Italian suits and unceremoniously shoved them into heavy-duty black garbage bags. Another guard was tossing Brittany's expensive shoes and cosmetic bags into a cardboard box in the hallway. The locks on the mahogany front door had already been drilled out and replaced with heavy industrial deadbolts. Preston lost his mind. He dropped his bags and charged at the nearest guard, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know who authorized this outrage, threatening to have them all arrested for breaking and entering. He puffed out his chest, shouting that he was a senior director on Wall Street and they were trespassing on his private property. Brittany stood by the elevator holding the twins and shrieking hysterically as she watched her designer items being piled onto a moving dolly. She yelled at Preston to do something, demanding he call the police immediately. The head of the security detail stepped forward, completely unfazed by Preston's screaming. He was a massive man with a cold, professional demeanor. He held up his hand, signaling his team to continue bagging up the luxury items, and calmly pulled a crisp, legally binding document from his jacket pocket. He did not yell or argue. He simply handed the paper to Preston. Preston snatched the document, his hands shaking violently as his eyes darted across the bold legal print. It was a formal, expedited eviction notice. Preston's heart practically stopped in his chest. For the entirety of our marriage, Preston believed he was the king of that castle. He assumed the luxury apartment was secured through his elite status and his impressive salary. But the fine print on the eviction notice revealed a devastating truth he had been too arrogant to ever notice. The penthouse was never in his name. It was a corporate perk, a luxury asset leased entirely through a real estate subsidiary of V Holdings. The company provided it to me as part of my anonymous executive compensation package. I had paid every single bill, and I held the ultimate authority over the property. The security chief looked Preston dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. The actual leaseholder has officially terminated the residency agreement. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather these garbage bags and vacate the premises, or my team will physically remove you. Preston stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the eviction notice as his newborn twins began to cry. He was completely broke, locked out of his own life, and officially homeless. Preston stood paralyzed in the hallway as the harsh reality of the eviction notice set in. He had exactly 10 minutes before the tactical security team would physically throw him out of the building. The security chief did not break eye contact. He simply pointed toward the service elevator. Brittany was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching the two infant carriers as the heavy mahogany doors of my former penthouse slammed shut in their faces. Preston was forced to swallow his massive pride. He scrambled across the marble floor, frantically gathering the heavy black garbage bags filled with his custom Italian suits and Brittany's expensive shoes. He dragged the bags into the service elevator, sweating profusely and avoiding the disgusted stares of the building staff. Since his credit cards were frozen and Sylvia's bank accounts were locked, they did not even have the money to hail a premium rideshare. They dragged their garbage bags onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk and were forced to flag down a standard yellow cab. Preston was desperate to maintain the illusion of control. He ordered the cab driver to take them to a famous luxury hotel in Midtown. He told Brittany that this was just a temporary setback, a minor corporate misunderstanding that would be resolved by morning. He promised her they would spend the weekend ordering room service in a five-star suite. They walked into the opulent lobby, looking completely out of place with their crying newborns and black plastic garbage bags. Preston approached the front desk, puffing out his chest and demanding their best available suite. He confidently handed the concierge his personal platinum card, hoping the bank freeze was just a glitch. The concierge swiped the card. It was instantly declined. Preston nervously patted his pockets and pulled out a different card, begging the man to run it manually. The concierge looked at his computer screen, his professional smile turning into a grimace. He informed Preston that not only were the cards declined, but his entire financial profile had been flagged for suspected fraud. The concierge signaled for hotel security, quietly asking Preston to leave the premises before he caused a public scene. Furious and completely humiliated, Preston had no choice but to admit defeat. With only a handful of cash Brittany had found at the bottom of her designer purse, they could not afford to stay in Manhattan. They directed the cab to drive across the bridge into Queens. They ended up at a dingy two-star motel nestled right next to a noisy highway overpass. The neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered ominously as Preston carried their garbage bags into a cramped room that smelled heavily of stale smoke and cheap cleaning supplies. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper was peeling, and the tiny window overlooked a parking lot filled with broken glass. The moment the cheap wooden door clicked shut, Brittany completely lost her mind. The delicate, sweet persona she had used to seduce my husband vanished entirely. She looked around the filthy motel room and threw a massive, explosive tantrum. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the two newborn infants crying in their carriers. She hurled her designer purse at Preston's chest, demanding to know why she was standing in a slum. She shrieked that she had endured 9 months of pregnancy and destroyed her friendship with me to become the wife of a wealthy executive, not to end up homeless in a roadside motel. She backed Preston into a corner, jabbing her finger into his chest, calling him a broke fraud and a pathetic loser. She ordered him to get on his phone and fix the situation instantly, or she would take the babies and leave him with absolutely nothing. Preston was suffocating under the weight of her screaming. He stumbled out the door and into the cold night air of the motel parking lot, desperate for a lifeline. He pulled out his phone and dialed his old college fraternity brother, a wealthy investment banker who had served as the best man at our wedding. Preston begged his friend for a quick loan, just enough cash to get them out of Queens and into a decent hotel until Monday morning. He tried to laugh it off as a simple banking error, playing the role of the inconvenienced millionaire. His best man did not offer sympathy. He let out a heavy sigh and cut Preston off mid-sentence. He said he could not help him. He told Preston that word was already spreading rapidly across Wall Street that he had committed massive corporate fraud. My sister-in-law Aisha had been incredibly busy. Working behind the scenes, Aisha had systematically leaked the exact digital footprints of Preston's forged collateral documents to every elite executive and legal counsel in their circle. She had exposed his illegal internal loan, his fake signatures, and the impending collapse of his firm. The best man ended the call with a final, devastating blow. He told Preston that he was completely radioactive, and absolutely no one in the financial sector was ever going to touch him again. My name is Vanessa, 33 years old, and I recently walked away from my cheating husband without shedding a single tear. Instead of crying over his betrayal with my former best friend, I used my anonymous position as a billionaire hedge fund CEO to legally dismantle his entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant betrayers get exactly what they deserve. Preston let his phone drop onto the stained bedspread. The dial tone hummed a flat, lifeless note that perfectly matched his new reality. His best man had just hung up on him. The fraternity brother who had sworn loyalty for life was now treating him like a walking disease. Preston sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper, while the undeniable truth washed over him. He was completely radioactive on Wall Street. He had no friends, no allies, and absolutely no money. In the corner of the cramped room, the newborn twins continued to wail. The piercing sound bounced off the cheap wood-paneled walls, amplifying the suffocating tension. Brittany paced the narrow strip of carpet between the bathroom and the window, her hands tightly covering her ears. She was wearing a silk designer robe that dragged across the questionable motel floor, her face twisted in pure disgust. She could not tolerate the noise. She absolutely refused to tolerate the poverty. She stopped pacing and glared at Preston, who was silently holding his head in his hands. She demanded the keys to her customized Porsche SUV. She announced she was leaving this filthy box to go shopping in Manhattan, claiming she desperately needed retail therapy to cope with his catastrophic incompetence. Preston was too broken to argue. He numbly pointed to the scratched veneer nightstand where the heavy leather-bound key fob rested. Brittany snatched the keys, threw on a pair of oversized designer sunglasses to hide her bloodshot eyes, and stormed out of the room. The heavy motel door slammed shut behind her, rattling the cheap doorframe. Brittany descended the concrete stairs to the parking lot, carefully navigating around discarded fast food wrappers in her expensive heels. She took a deep breath of the cold night air, eager to slide into the pristine climate-controlled interior of her luxury vehicle. She rounded the corner of the building, pressing the unlock button on her fob, anticipating the familiar flash of the bright headlights. Instead of a welcoming chirp, she was met with the harsh grinding sound of heavy machinery. A massive industrial tow truck was idling directly in front of her parking space. Its amber warning lights rotated brightly, cutting through the dim glow of the motel parking lot. A burly man in a reflective vest was currently operating a hydraulic winch, efficiently securing heavy steel chains around the rear axles of her pristine white Porsche. Brittany completely lost all sense of decorum. She sprinted across the cracked asphalt, waving her arms frantically and screaming at the top of her lungs. She ordered the man to drop the vehicle instantly. She placed herself directly between the tow truck and her car, demanding he unhook the chains before she called the police and had him arrested for grand theft auto. She puffed out her chest loudly, proclaiming that her husband was a highly successful Wall Street executive, a multi-millionaire who would personally ensure this towing company was sued into absolute oblivion. The tow truck operator did not flinch. He did not yell back or look intimidated by her designer clothes or her hysterical threats. He simply secured the final chain, wiped his grease-stained hands on his work pants, and let out a dry, rumbling laugh. He looked at Brittany with a mixture of amusement and utter exhaustion. He walked over to the cab of his truck, retrieved a clipboard, and peeled off a yellow carbon copy document. He handed it directly to her without a single word. Brittany snatched this paper, her hands trembling with rage as she squinted to read the bold print under the harsh parking lot lights. It was not a parking ticket or a towing mistake. It was a formal expedited vehicle repossession order. The document explicitly stated that the financing used to purchase the vehicle had been flagged as fraudulent and subsequently defaulted. The authorized creditor, listed at the very top of the page, was Apex Solutions. My shadow company had not just choked Preston's corporate credit. We had systematically seized every single physical asset tied to his illegal internal loan. Brittany stood frozen on the asphalt, the yellow paper fluttering in the cold wind. She watched helplessly as the tow truck driver climbed into his cab, shifted into gear, and pulled away. Her ultimate status symbol, the physical proof of her victory over me, was dragged out of the motel parking lot and disappeared into the heavy Queens traffic. She was completely stranded. The walk back up to the motel room felt like a death march. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing through the catastrophic implications of what had just happened. She pushed open the door to find the room entirely dark, save for the flickering neon light seeping through the cheap window blinds. Preston had passed out face down on the bed, entirely consumed by sheer physical and mental exhaustion. The twins had finally cried themselves to sleep in their carriers. Brittany stood in the shadows staring at the man she had sacrificed her reputation to secure. Her paranoia was running at maximum capacity. She needed answers. She needed to know exactly how deep this financial crater truly was. She crept over to the nightstand, carefully picked up Preston's smartphone, and used his thumb to unlock the biometric scanner while he slept heavily. She bypassed his personal messages and opened his secure corporate email application. At the very top of the inbox was an email marked with high importance from his firm's Global Human Resources Department. Brittany tapped the screen. The message was cold, formal, and devastatingly clear. It stated that Preston was officially terminated from his position as senior director, effective immediately. The email cited gross corporate embezzlement, unauthorized diversion of company funds, and severe financial fraud as the primary causes for termination. It further noted that federal authorities had been notified of his actions. The harsh blue light of the phone screen illuminated Brittany's pale face. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. Preston was not a Wall Street titan experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. He was a disgraced, terminated criminal with absolute $0 to his name. She had burned down her friendship with me and destroyed her own social standing to secure a golden ticket, only to realize she had firmly chained herself to a rapidly sinking ship. While Brittany was discovering the absolute ruin of her new reality in a cheap Queens motel, her mother-in-law was busy putting on a masterclass in delusion across the river. Sylvia had no idea her son had just been terminated for federal fraud or that he was currently sleeping on a stained mattress. In her mind, the crisis was averted the moment she pawned her vintage diamond necklace to pay for the hospital deposit. To counteract any rumors that might have leaked about Preston's momentary credit freeze, Sylvia did what she always did when backed into a corner. She threw money she did not have at a highly visible social event. She was hosting an exclusive charity luncheon at her private country club on the Upper East Side. The ballroom was draped in white silk, and 50 of Manhattan's wealthiest socialites sat at round tables sipping premium champagne. Sylvia stood at the head of the room, draped in cashmere, playing the role of the triumphant matriarch. She moved from table to table, loudly bragging about her brand-new twin grandchildren, making sure everyone knew they were resting in the VIP maternity ward. She boasted about Preston's upcoming promotion to partner, claiming his recent real estate acquisitions were the talk of Wall Street. It was a desperate, transparent performance designed to solidify her bloodline's elite status. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Aisha walked in wearing a flawless emerald green designer suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. As an accomplished corporate lawyer and the wife of Sylvia's older son, Aisha commanded absolute authority. She was also the only African-American woman in the room, a fact Sylvia had constantly weaponized over the past 5 years with passive-aggressive microaggressions. Sylvia had always treated Aisha as an outsider, a diversity hire who should be eternally grateful to be associated with their family. Today, Aisha was not there to play the grateful daughter-in-law. She was there to deliver the execution. Aisha glided across the room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She bypassed the empty chair Sylvia had relegated to the back of the room and took a seat directly at the main table, right in the center of Sylvia's most judgmental peers. Sylvia's forced smile tightened into a grimace. She quickly walked over, resting a hand on the back of Aisha's chair, and adopted her sweetest, most condescending tone. She loudly welcomed Aisha, mentioning how surprised she was that Aisha could take time away from drafting boring legal contracts to attend a high society function. Aisha did not flinch. She picked up a crystal water glass, took a slow sip, and looked directly into Sylvia's eyes. She matched Sylvia's volume perfectly, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear every single word. "I actually had a remarkably open schedule today," Sylvia Aisha said, her voice dripping with polished corporate venom. "My legal team just finished reviewing a rather massive internal audit at Preston's Real Estate Investment Trust. Have you spoken to your son this morning?" Sylvia waved her hand dismissively, telling the surrounding women that Preston was far too busy closing multi-million-dollar deals to chat with his mother. Aisha smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that made the wealthy women at the table lean in closer. "He is definitely busy," Aisha agreed smoothly, "though I highly doubt he is closing any deals." Word on the executive floor is that his firm was just subjected to a hostile takeover by a shadow company. They initiated a total margin call yesterday. In fact, Human Resources spent the entire night terminating several senior directors for gross corporate embezzlement. The color began to drain from Sylvia's meticulously contoured face. The surrounding socialites exchanged wide-eyed, hungry glances. Gossip was the absolute currency of this room, and Aisha was handing them gold. Sylvia tried to laugh it off, stammering that Aisha was clearly misinformed, insisting Preston was the golden boy of his firm. Aisha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a surgical precise pitch. I am never misinformed about financial fraud, Sylvia. Especially when the terminated director leaves a digital trail of unauthorized loans and forged collateral documents. You should really check your personal banking app. It is truly amazing how fast federal authorities can freeze an entire family's assets when one person gets a little too greedy. Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from the table, her hands trembling violently. Desperate to change the subject and regain control of her crumbling narrative, she rushed to the front of the room. She grabbed a silver spoon and clinked it against her champagne flute, demanding everyone's attention for her keynote toast. She pasted on a frantic smile, preparing to thank her wealthy friends for attending her lavish luncheon. Before she could utter a single word, the heavy double doors opened again. The club's general manager marched into the ballroom, flanked by the head of catering. They did not look deferential. They looked strictly managerial. The general manager bypassed the guest tables and walked straight up to Sylvia at the podium. He did not bother to lower his voice. Madam, the manager said, holding out a black leather billing folder, we have a severe problem. We attempted to run the $50,000 authorization for today's event as per our standard policy. Your primary platinum card has been declined. The entire ballroom fell completely silent. 50 of Manhattan's elite socialites stared unblinking at the podium. Sylvia gasped, her face turning a deep, humiliating shade of red. She quickly dug into her designer purse, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her lipstick on the floor. She pulled out a secondary gold card and shoved it at the manager, hissing at him to try it again and stop causing a scene. The manager pulled a wireless terminal from his pocket and swiped the gold card right there in front of the silent audience. A loud, sharp beep echoed through the ballroom. Declined. The manager looked Sylvia dead in the eye. He informed her that the bank had attached a hard fraud freeze to her entire financial profile. He loudly requested that she provide an alternate form of payment immediately, or he would be forced to shut down the event and call the authorities for theft of services. Sylvia stood frozen at the podium, completely stripped of her wealthy facade. Her platinum cards were useless plastic. Her son was a terminated criminal. Her historic estate was secretly mortgaged to my company. She looked across the room and locked eyes with Aisha. Aisha simply raised her glass of champagne in a silent, mocking toast. The entire country club was currently watching Sylvia's carefully constructed empire burn to the ground, and she did not even have the cash to buy a bucket of water. The heavy, suffocating reality of the two-star motel in Queens was entirely unbearable for a woman who had staked her entire existence on securing a Manhattan penthouse. The peeling floral wallpaper seemed to close in on Brittany as the flickering neon vacancy sign outside cast harsh, irregular shadows across the stained carpet. In the corner of the cramped room, the newborn twins were crying relentlessly. Their high-pitched wails bounced off the cheap wood-paneled walls, creating an echoing nightmare that Brittany simply refused to tolerate. She sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring with pure disgust at the man she had sacrificed her reputation to steal. Preston was lying face down on the bed, entirely paralyzed by the termination email he had received earlier that evening. He was wearing the wrinkled remains of his custom-tailored suit, reeking of stale sweat and absolute defeat. He had completely shut down, unable to process the fact that he was a disgraced, terminated criminal with zero liquidity and millions in debt. He did not move to comfort the crying infants. He did not speak. He just lay there like a discarded corpse on a sinking ship. Brittany looked at him, and any trace of the fabricated affection she had used to seduce him vanished completely. She was not a mother operating on maternal instinct. She was a highly calculated social climber, and she recognized a dead investment when she saw one. She had not destroyed her friendship with me to end up trapped in a roadside slum with a broke loser and two screaming liabilities. She needed an immediate exit strategy, and she knew exactly how to execute it. She stood up, stepping right over Preston's discarded leather shoes, and walked over to the black plastic garbage bags huddled in the corner of the room. She aggressively tore open the plastic, digging through her salvaged belongings until she found exactly what she was looking for. She pulled out a sleek, form-fitting black silk cocktail dress and a pair of pristine designer heels. She carried her clothes into the tiny, unventilated bathroom and locked the flimsy door behind her. Standing in front of the cracked mirror illuminated by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb, Brittany completely transformed herself. She applied her makeup with surgical precision, masking the exhaustion of the past 48 hours. She styled her hair to fall perfectly over her shoulders, putting back on the alluring, fragile persona that had always successfully trapped wealthy, ego-driven men. She stepped back, smoothing the black silk over her figure. She was ready to go hunting. She walked out of the bathroom, grabbed the last $50 bill from Preston's wallet on the nightstand, and headed straight for the door. Preston barely shifted on the mattress. She did not say goodbye. She did not check on the crying twins. She simply walked out into the cold night air, leaving them all behind without a single ounce of hesitation. Brittany took the subway back into Manhattan, despising every second of the dirty, crowded commute. She got off in the financial district and walked 2 blocks to the Oak Room, an incredibly upscale, dimly lit hotel bar, renowned for catering to traveling hedge fund managers and venture capitalists. She slipped through the heavy mahogany doors, instantly relaxing as the scent of expensive cologne and premium leather washed over her. This was her natural habitat. She approached the polished marble bar, ordered a simple sparkling water with a lime wedge to conserve her stolen cash, and began to survey the room. She bypassed the loud groups of junior analysts and focused her attention on the quieter, darker corners of the lounge. It only took her 10 minutes to spot the perfect target. He was sitting alone in a curved leather booth, nursing a glass of dark amber scotch. He was handsome, possessing sharp features and a relaxed, commanding posture. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit that screamed custom tailoring, but it was the heavy, gleaming platinum Rolex Daytona on his left wrist that sealed the deal. He looked bored, incredibly wealthy, and entirely unattached. Brittany took a slow, calculated breath, adjusted the neckline of her silk dress, and glided across the lounge. She approached his booth with a perfectly practiced, hesitant smile. She softly asked if the seat across from him was taken, claiming the bar was too crowded, and she just needed a quiet place to catch her breath. The man looked up, his eyes sweeping over her approvingly. He flashed a brilliant, charming smile and gestured for her to sit down. They introduced themselves. The man said his name was David. He claimed to be a private equity investor visiting from London, currently in town, to finalize a few corporate acquisitions. Brittany immediately turned on the full force of her victim narrative. David proved to be the perfect audience. He ordered her a $200 glass of vintage champagne and leaned forward, giving her his undivided, sympathetic attention. Brittany painted herself as a tragic, misunderstood figure going through a devastating transitional period. She complained bitterly about her deadbeat husband. She explicitly stated she had been deceived by a manipulative fraud who promised her a life of luxury, but turned out to be a broke, useless liar. She spun a masterclass story of being trapped in a miserable situation, forced to carry the weight of a man who could not even provide for his own family. David shook his head in sympathetic disbelief, feeding her ego with exactly the right responses. He told her it was an absolute tragedy for a woman of her caliber to be treated so poorly. He leaned in closer, the dim light catching the edge of his platinum Rolex, and asked what a beautiful, intelligent woman like her was going to do about such a terrible situation. Brittany leaned across the table, tracing the delicate rim of her crystal champagne flute with her finger. She looked deeply into his eyes and explicitly stated she was looking for a permanent exit strategy. She complained about the heavy, suffocating burden of her newborn twins, calling them an anchor she never truly wanted. She told David that she was completely ready to walk away from all of it tonight, to leave the broke loser and the crying infants in the past, if she could just find a real man who knew how to properly take care of a woman. She reached across the mahogany table and placed her hand softly over his, feeling the cold, expensive metal of his watch against her palm. The romantic tension in the booth peaked. Brittany waited for the inevitable invitation up to his luxury hotel suite. Instead, David slowly pulled his hand away from hers. His warm, inviting smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, purely clinical expression. The charming venture capitalist persona dissolved completely. He reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke navy suit. He did not pull out a room key or a platinum credit card. He pulled out a sleek, high-definition recording device. He placed the device gently on the mahogany table right next to her half-empty glass of champagne. He looked Brittany dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a sharp professional tone. "My boss thought you might say that." Preston sat on the edge of the sagging motel mattress, completely ignoring the relentless wailing of his newborn twins. The cheap wood-paneled walls of the Queen's motel room seemed to close in on him as he desperately typed on a battered laptop he had managed to borrow from the front desk clerk. His custom-tailored suit was now stained and wrinkled beyond repair, sticking to his sweating back. He was a man drowning in a financial abyss, entirely stripped of his corporate armor, and he was currently attempting the most reckless maneuver of his life. Since his Wall Street career was completely destroyed and his credit was entirely frozen, Preston knew conventional banking was a locked door. He was currently scouring the darkest corners of the internet, searching for predatory lenders and unregulated payday loan sharks who might front him emergency cash without running a standard background check. He was frantically trying to forge a new set of digital documents. He planned to use the remaining equity in his mother's name, hoping to manipulate a secondary property title Sylvia owned in the Hamptons. His hands shook violently over the keyboard as he tried to copy and paste legal jargon, perfectly aware that if he was caught, he would face decades in a federal prison. But he was operating on pure blind panic. He convinced himself that if he could just secure $10,000, he could move Brittany into a decent hotel and buy himself enough time to hire a sleazy defense attorney. He desperately needed Brittany to stay. In his fractured, ego-driven mind, she was the ultimate prize. He had won the beautiful trophy that justified destroying his marriage to me. He rationalized her dramatic exit earlier that evening. He told himself she was just overwhelmed by the premature birth and the sudden change in their living situation. He firmly believed she would return to the motel, calm down, and stand by his side like a loyal partner. A sharp chime echoed through the cramped room. Preston jumped, nearly knocking the cheap laptop off his knees. His smartphone lit up on the scratched nightstand. He grabbed the device, hoping it was a notification from one of the predatory lenders approving his forged application. Instead, the screen displayed a secure encrypted text message from an unknown number. There was no text attached to the message. There was only a massive high-definition video file. Preston frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. Driven by a mix of paranoia and curiosity, he tapped the file and allowed the video to download. The screen went dark for a fraction of a second before the crystal-clear footage began to play. The video had been recorded from a stationary hidden angle, providing a perfect view of a dimly lit, incredibly upscale mahogany booth. Preston instantly recognized the ambient lighting and the expensive leather upholstery. It was the Oak Room, a famously elite bar in the financial district, where he used to conduct his own high-rolling business meetings. The camera angle shifted slightly, focusing entirely on the woman sitting on the left side of the booth. It was Brittany. She was wearing her black silk cocktail dress, looking absolutely stunning and perfectly composed. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, and she held a $200 glass of vintage champagne. Preston felt a sickening knot form in the pit of his stomach. While he was sitting in a squalid motel room listening to their children scream, his supposedly loyal partner was drinking premium champagne in one of the most expensive bars in Manhattan. Then the audio kicked in. The hidden microphone was exceptionally high quality. It picked up every single whisper over the low jazz music playing in the background. Preston heard the deep, charming voice of a man with a British accent asking Brittany a question. Then he heard Brittany's response. Her voice dripped with absolute venom and contempt. Preston watched in sheer horror as the woman he had sacrificed his entire life for systematically tore him apart. He heard Brittany explicitly call him a deadbeat, a broke loser, and a pathetic fraud. She laughed as she told the stranger that she had been completely deceived by a manipulative liar who promised her a life of luxury but delivered nothing but absolute failure. Preston could not breathe. His chest tightened painfully as the video continued to play. The man off camera asked Brittany what she planned to do about her situation. Preston watched Brittany lean seductively across the mahogany table. He watched her reach out and gently place her hand over the stranger's arm. He heard her explicitly offer to abandon her entire family. She looked directly into the hidden camera lens and stated she was looking for a permanent exit strategy. She complained bitterly about the heavy, suffocating burden of the newborn twins, referring to his children as an anchor she never truly wanted. Preston listened to the mother of his children tell a total stranger that she was completely ready to walk away tonight, to leave the broke loser and the crying infants in the past, if the wealthy man sitting across from her would just take care of her. The video abruptly cut to black. The heavy silence of the motel room returned, broken only by the whimpering of the hungry infants in the corner. Preston dropped the phone onto the mattress. His entire reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. The illusion he had built was completely annihilated. Brittany did not love him. She never loved him. She was a calculated, ruthless gold digger who had viewed him as nothing more than a profitable investment. And the exact second his accounts were frozen, she had dressed up and gone out to find a replacement entirely willing to leave her own newborn babies in a slum. A dark, violent anger began to boil in Preston's veins. He had thrown away a stable, peaceful marriage with a billionaire CEO for a woman who tried to jump ship less than 48 hours after giving birth. He sat in the darkness, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands balled into tight fists, waiting for the inevitable. An hour later, the flimsy lock on the motel door rattled. The hinges creaked loudly as the door swung open. Brittany walked into the room, letting the door slam shut behind her. She looked exhausted and incredibly bitter. Her attempt to secure a new sugar daddy had obviously failed when my head of security revealed his true identity. Left with no other options and only the last remnants of Preston's stolen cash, she had been forced to return to the Queen's Motel. She was carrying a bright paper shopping bag from Zara, having spent the last few dollars on a cheap distraction to soothe her bruised ego. She sighed loudly, dropping the shopping bag onto the stained carpet, and turned to face the bed, expecting to find Preston still passed out in defeat. Instead, Preston was standing perfectly still in the center of the narrow room. The blue light from his smartphone illuminated his face. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and burning with absolute fury. He held the phone up the screen, paused on a high-definition, still image of Brittany leaning across the table at the Oak Room. Preston took a slow step forward, his voice a dangerous, trembling whisper. "Where were you tonight, Brittany?" "I quietly signed my divorce papers at a luxury baby shower after discovering my husband was the father of my best friend's unborn twins. I did not scream or throw a fit when my mother-in-law shoved a $10,000 check against my chest as severance pay. I simply walked into the elevator and made a single phone call that would wipe out their entire financial existence by morning. My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down the lives of those who betrayed you." The baby shower was a masterclass in Manhattan extravagance. I had rented out a private rooftop garden overlooking Central Park, paying for the imported white orchids, the catered caviar appetizers, and the live string quartet entirely out of my own pocket. I did this because the guest of honor was Brittany, a woman I had considered my closest confidant since our college days. She was glowing in a designer maternity dress surrounded by 50 of our closest friends and colleagues, celebrating the impending arrival of her twins. Everyone thought I was the ultimate supportive friend throwing this massive party to celebrate a single mother-to-be. My husband Preston stood by the open bar laughing loudly with his finance buddies. At 35, he was a senior director at a prominent real estate investment trust. He loved expensive tailored suits, flashy luxury watches, and reminding everyone that my job as a corporate risk assessor was incredibly boring. I always let him have his ego. He had absolutely no idea that my quiet desk job was actually a carefully constructed cover. In reality, I was the sole heir and anonymous CEO of V Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund known for ruthlessly acquiring distressed assets. The afternoon sun was warm, so Brittany asked me to fetch her silk wrap from the coat check room inside the venue. I gladly obliged, eager to make sure she was comfortable. As I picked up her expensive designer trench coat from the hanger, a crumpled piece of paper slipped from the pocket and landed face up on the polished marble floor. I bent down to pick it up, assuming it was a dry cleaning ticket or a valet receipt. It was a medical invoice for a premium private ultrasound clinic. I scanned the typed lines. Patient name, Brittany. Payer name, Preston. Total cost, $12,000 paid in full by his personal credit card. Below the billing information was a secondary note confirming the primary emergency contact as the biological father. The name printed there was Preston. I stood alone in the coat room for a long moment. The string quartet played a cheerful classical tune in the background, contrasting sharply with the ringing in my ears. My husband and my best friend were having twins together. They had been carrying on an affair right under my nose, and I had just paid a small fortune to host their lavish celebration. I did not cry. My intense corporate training kicked in immediately. You do not mourn a toxic investment. You cut your losses and you liquidate it. I walked back into the main event space, holding the crumpled receipt firmly in my hand. Preston was standing near the center of the room, holding a glass of vintage champagne and soaking in the attention of his peers. I walked straight up to him and handed him the piece of paper. He took it, read the top line, and his smug smile completely vanished. For a split second, I saw genuine panic flash in his eyes. Then he looked over at Brittany, who had hurried over to join us. Instead of apologizing or pulling me aside to explain, Preston did the exact opposite. He signaled the string quartet to stop playing. The sudden, awkward silence drew the attention of all 50 guests. Preston took a microphone from the event staff and wrapped his free arm tightly around Brittany's waist. He looked at me with absolute contempt and spoke directly into the microphone. There is no point in hiding this anymore. Brittany is giving me the legacy you could not provide. We are having twins. The room erupted in shocked gasps and hushed whispers. Preston continued, his voice echoing across the silent rooftop. You have been holding me back for years, Vanessa. You care more about your boring spreadsheets than building a family. I need the penthouse for my real family now. Pack your bags tonight and leave the keys on the counter. I stood perfectly still, letting the public humiliation wash over me without showing a single ounce of weakness. Brittany looked down, playing the role of the fragile victim, but I caught the corner of her mouth twitching upward in a triumphant smirk. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken the boring risk assessor. Before I could even respond, my mother-in-law, Sylvia, pushed her way to the front of the stunned crowd. At 60 years old, Sylvia considered herself Manhattan royalty, despite the fact that her family's wealth was built on massive piles of debt. She despised me because she believed I was a middle-class nobody dragging down her son's elite social status. She dug into her oversized designer purse and pulled out a folded document along with a cashier's check. She shoved the papers forcefully against my chest. It was a pre-printed divorce agreement already signed by Preston in blue ink. Attached to the front page was a check for $10,000. Take the severance pay! Dear, Sylvia sneered, pitching her voice loudly enough for the entire front row of guests to hear. My son needs a strong bloodline to carry on our family name. He does not need a sterile calculator dragging down his potential. Take the money, call a taxi, and leave these two to celebrate their beautiful new family in peace. The cruelty in her voice was calculated, designed to break me in front of my peers and force me into submission. She fully expected me to burst into tears and run away in shame. Instead, I calmly took the divorce papers from her hand. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out my heavy Mont Blanc pen. Without a single tear or a word of protest, I flipped to the final signature page and signed my name on the dotted line. I handed the legal document back to Sylvia, who looked momentarily confused by my lack of emotion. Then I let the $10,000 check flutter from my fingers, watching it land directly on Preston's expensive leather shoes. "Keep the change," I said, my voice incredibly steady and ice cold. "You are going to need it to buy diapers." I turned my back on my husband, my former best friend, and my cruel mother-in-law. I walked straight through the crowd of stunned guests, keeping my head held high and my posture perfect. I did not look back once as I exited the beautiful rooftop garden and pressed the button for the elevator. The elevator doors slid open and I stepped inside the empty cabin. As soon as the heavy metal doors closed, completely blocking out the sound of their celebration, I pulled out my phone. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed a secure unlisted corporate number. It was picked up on the first ring by the chief operating officer of V Holdings. "This is the CEO," I said, my tone completely void of emotion. "Initiate the liquidation protocol on the real estate investment trust where Preston works. Buy up their primary debt and trigger an immediate hostile margin call. I want their corporate credit lines choked to death by tomorrow morning." The voice on the other end simply replied, "Consider it done." I hung up the phone and watched the floor numbers tick downward. Preston wanted to build a lasting legacy with my best friend. He was about to find out that the sterile calculator he just threw away owned the very ground he stood on. The sharp, echoing crack of Sylvia slapping her son across the face rang through the grand marble foyer of the historic Manhattan estate. Preston stumbled backward, his hand flying to his reddening cheek. He looked at his mother in absolute shock. For his entire life, Sylvia had treated him like a golden prince who could do no wrong. Now she was looking at him with a mixture of sheer terror and pure, unfiltered hatred. Sylvia stood at the base of her sweeping mahogany staircase, her hands shaking violently as she clutched the crisp legal foreclosure notice she had just received. She had spent the last 30 years cultivating an image of impenetrable wealth and elite social standing. She hosted charity galas, drank premium champagne at private country clubs, and looked down on anyone who actually had to work for a living. And now her golden child had burned her entire kingdom to the ground. "You forged my signature!" Sylvia screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "You bypassed my lawyers and illegally mortgaged the only real asset this family has left. You traded my ancestral home to a shadow corporation just to buy a sports car for that cheap gold-digging mistress." Preston did not apologize. His massive, fragile ego had been shattered into pieces over the last 48 hours, and he was currently operating on pure, desperate rage. He dropped his hands to his sides and stepped toward his mother, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Do not stand there and act like a victim," Preston shouted back. "You have been entirely broke for a decade, mother. You spend money we do not have just to impress a bunch of snobby socialites who do not even like you. I only took that loan because I needed to maintain the standard of living you constantly demanded. You taught me that image is everything. I just played the game exactly the way you raised me to play it." Sylvia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. She looked down at the antique Persian rug where Preston had unceremoniously dropped the 2 infant carriers containing his newborn twins. The babies were crying, relentlessly hungry and exhausted, but neither Preston nor Sylvia paid them the slightest bit of attention. The infants were nothing more than the physical proof of Preston's spectacular failure. "I just called Aisha," Sylvia cried out, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. "I demanded she use her corporate legal license to sue the bank and stop this foreclosure. Do you know what she told me? She told me she does not work for racists. She told me she represents the buyer now. Your own sister-in-law has abandoned us to the wolves." Preston dragged his hands through his unwashed hair. He paced across the foyer, desperately trying to formulate a plan. He blamed everyone but himself. He blamed Brittany for abandoning him at the motel. He blamed Aisha for being a treacherous traitor. He even blamed me, his quiet, boring ex-wife, claiming that if I had just been a more supportive partner, he never would have needed to seek out a mistress in the first place. They tore each other apart right there in the entryway, 2 incredibly toxic people finally facing the absolute ruin of their own greed. Their explosive screaming match was abruptly interrupted by a low, powerful rumbling sound coming from outside. Sylvia stopped yelling and turned toward the massive arched windows flanking the front door. She expected to see a delivery truck, or perhaps one of her wealthy neighbors arriving for an unannounced visit. Instead, she watched a fleet of 4 sleek, jet-black armored sport utility vehicles pull up to the wrought iron gates of her property. The vehicles moved with terrifying synchronized military precision. They parked in a strategic formation, completely blocking the entrance and exit of the circular driveway. Sylvia felt the blood drain entirely from her face. "Who are those people?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The doors of the heavy vehicles swung open simultaneously. A dozen men dressed in sharp, tactical black suits stepped out onto the pavement. They were not local police officers. They were not standard debt collectors. They were elite private corporate security contractors. They moved with silent, absolute authority. 2 of the men walked directly to the towering wrought iron gates, pulled a heavy length of industrial steel chain through the metal bars, and secured it with a massive padlock. The other men fanned out, taking up stationary positions at every single exit point of the perimeter. The historic Manhattan estate was officially under siege. Preston watched the scene unfold through the glass, his arrogant entitlement flaring up one final time. He was a man who had lost his job, his money, and his reputation, but he absolutely refused to accept his new reality. He was convinced this was just an aggressive intimidation tactic from a low-level creditor. He threw open the heavy mahogany front doors and stormed out onto the cold stone steps of the porch. He marched down the driveway, waving his arms aggressively and screaming at the top of his lungs. "Get off my property right now!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn. "You are trespassing on private land. I am a senior director on Wall Street, and I will have every single one of you arrested for illegal harassment. I am calling the police, and I am calling the mayor." The private security contractors did not flinch. They did not yell back or reach for their weapons. They completely ignored Preston's hysterical threats, treating him like a minor, irrelevant nuisance. The lead security guard, a massive man with a cold, professional gaze, stepped forward. He did not look at Preston. He looked past him toward the padlocked gates. A deep, purring engine signaled the arrival of a 5th vehicle. A jet-black Custom stretched. Maybach glided smoothly down the street. The security guards immediately unlocked the heavy chains and pulled the iron gates open. The luxurious vehicle rolled onto the private driveway, the dark-tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. It came to a slow, silent stop, right at the base of the sweeping marble staircase, just a few feet away from where Preston was standing. Preston was practically foaming at the mouth. He marched directly toward the rear passenger door of the Maybach, fully intending to physically drag the arrogant creditor out of the back seat and demand they call off the foreclosure. Before Preston could even touch the polished door handle, the lead security guard stepped directly into his path. The guard formed an impenetrable wall of solid muscle, forcing Preston to stop dead in his tracks. The guard did not say a word. He simply reached out and opened the heavy armored door of the Maybach. The heavy armored door of the custom Maybach swung open with a smooth, silent glide. Preston stood on the cold stone of the driveway, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He was fully prepared to scream at a faceless corporate banker. He was ready to unleash every threat in his arsenal against whatever arrogant executive dared to padlock his mother's gates. He watched a pair of pristine, emerald green designer heels step out onto the pavement. Aisha stood up to her full height, smoothing the lapels of her flawless, custom-tailored suit. She held a sleek black leather briefcase in her left hand. The afternoon wind caught her natural hair, framing her face in absolute, uncompromising authority. She looked down at Preston, her expression completely devoid of the polite, accommodating warmth she had been forced to display at family dinners for the past 5 years. She did not look like a sister-in-law. She looked like an executioner. Preston staggered backward, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He blinked rapidly, utterly incapable of processing the scene before him. For a fleeting second, his broken ego tried to rationalize her presence. He actually thought she had come to save him. He took a step forward, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what she was doing riding in the creditor's vehicle. Aisha did not answer him. She did not even acknowledge his question. She simply adjusted her briefcase and began walking up the sweeping marble staircase toward the grand mahogany front doors. The private security contractors immediately parted to let her through, treating her with the utmost deference and respect. Sylvia was standing on the grand landing of the porch, clutching her cashmere shawl tightly around her trembling shoulders. When she saw her daughter-in-law ascending the stairs, flanked by tactical security, her initial shock rapidly morphed into deeply ingrained condescending rage. Sylvia had spent years treating Aisha like a second-class citizen, constantly making thinly veiled remarks about her African-American heritage, treating her brilliant legal career as nothing more than a convenient free resource for the family. Sylvia marched to the edge of the top step, pointing a shaking finger directly at Aisha. She demanded to know why her daughter-in-law was leading a private army of thugs onto her historic property. She shrieked that she would call her oldest son and demand he file for divorce this very instant. She ordered Aisha to call off the guards and use her legal license to fix this massive banking error immediately. Aisha reached the top of the stairs and stopped just 2 feet away from Sylvia. She did not raise her voice. She did not show a single ounce of intimidation. She looked Sylvia dead in the eye, her tone dropping to a surgical, precise pitch. "I filed my divorce papers at 8 o'clock this morning," Sylvia Aisha said, her voice echoing sharply off the stone columns. "I am no longer your unpaid legal fixer. I no longer have to sit at your dining table and swallow your racist, pathetic microaggressions. I am standing on this porch in my official capacity as the chief legal officer for the entity that currently owns every single brick of this estate." Aisha popped the gold clasps of her leather briefcase. The sharp click sounded like a gunshot in the tense, quiet air of the driveway. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the bright red expedited seals of the state Supreme Court. She held them out, not waiting for Sylvia to take them, and instead dropped the heavy stack directly onto the marble porch at Sylvia's feet. "Consider yourselves formally served," Aisha announced, her voice carrying the absolute weight of the law. "These are the final, non-negotiable eviction and asset seizure notices. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before my security team physically removes you and locks down the property." Preston charged up the stairs. His face flushed a deep, dangerous red. He completely ignored the legal documents on the ground, getting right into Aisha's face. He screamed that she had no right to do this. He demanded to know how she could possibly represent a predatory shadow company like Apex Solutions. He puffed out his chest, claiming he was going to report her to the State Bar Association for a massive conflict of interest. Aisha simply smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression that made Preston instinctively take a step back. "There is no conflict of interest," Preston Aisha replied smoothly. "Because you committed federal wire fraud, I am legally obligated to report your actions, not defend them. You were so desperate to buy your gold-digging mistress a new sports car that you bypassed my department entirely. You routed a massive internal loan through a dummy server and forged your own mother's signature to cross-collateralize this exact property." Sylvia let out a strangled, horrified gasp. She looked at Preston, her eyes wide with total devastation. Aisha did not give them a single second to recover. She continued to systematically dismantle Preston's entire reality, right there on the front steps, ensuring every word cut deep. "You thought you were a financial genius," Aisha said, her voice dripping with pure corporate venom. "But you are just a sloppy, arrogant thief. You handed the deed to this historic estate directly to a hedge fund that specializes in hostile takeovers. You defaulted the second they issued the margin call this morning. Because of your forged signature, the bank has placed a hard freeze on every single account tied to Sylvia's name. You did not just destroy your own career. You bankrupted your entire bloodline in less than 48 hours. Preston felt the blood roaring in his ears. His mind was fracturing under the weight of his absolute failure. He looked at the armed security guards blocking his driveway. He looked at the custom Maybach idling on the pavement. He looked at Aisha, the woman he had consistently mocked behind her back, currently holding the power to render him homeless and send him to a federal prison. His fragile ego simply could not handle the humiliation. He snapped. Preston threw his head back and let out a loud, hysterical bark of laughter. It was a jagged, unhinged sound that bordered on total madness. He pointed a shaking finger at Aisha, desperately trying to reassert his imaginary dominance. "You think you can do this to me?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You think a diversity hire lawyer can just waltz in here and take my family's legacy? You are nothing but a highly paid messenger. I refuse to negotiate with a subordinate. I demand to speak to the actual boss. I demand to speak to the CEO of V Holdings right now. Bring him out here so I can settle this man to man." Aisha looked at Preston. She looked at his stained, wrinkled suit and his wild, bloodshot eyes. She closed her leather briefcase, the gold clasp snapping shut with absolute finality. A serene, incredibly satisfied smile spread across her face. She took a deliberate step to the side, clearing the path to the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion. She is already inside. Preston shoved past Aisha, his heavy footsteps pounding against the marble steps. Sylvia followed closely behind him, clutching her cashmere shawl, her breathing shallow and erratic. They burst through the towering mahogany front doors, leaving the cold afternoon air and the impenetrable wall of armed security guards behind them. The grand foyer of the historic Manhattan estate echoed with their frantic, desperate energy. Preston marched directly toward the formal living room, fully expecting to find a ruthless, aging Wall Street billionaire waiting to strip his family of their final asset. He was ready to beg, bargain, and manipulate whoever was in charge of Apex Solutions. Instead, he froze dead in his tracks, right under the massive crystal chandelier. Sylvia collided heavily with his back, letting out a sharp gasp as she peered around his shoulder to see what had stopped him. The formal living room was a sprawling monument to old money opulence. It featured soaring vaulted ceilings, priceless original oil paintings, and a massive carved marble fireplace. The air smelled of expensive lilies and lemon oil, a stark contrast to the foul stench of desperation radiating from Preston. Right in the absolute center of the room, sitting comfortably in Sylvia's highly coveted custom velvet antique armchair, was me. I had completely shed the quiet, unremarkable disguise I had worn for the entirety of our 10-year marriage. Gone were the muted, sensible cardigans and the invisible middle-class risk assessor persona. I was wearing an immaculate, razor-sharp, midnight blue tailored designer suit that radiated absolute corporate authority. My hair was perfectly styled, and a delicate diamond watch rested quietly on my wrist. My posture was flawless. My expression was perfectly composed, entirely devoid of any anger, sadness, or residual heartbreak. I sat with my legs crossed, holding a sleek silver pen, looking entirely at home in the very estate my former mother-in-law had repeatedly told me I was not good enough to enter. For a long, agonizing moment, the grand living room was trapped in total, suffocating silence. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. I simply watched them. I watched the gears in Preston's fractured mind grind to a catastrophic halt. His brain violently rejected the visual evidence right in front of him. He simply could not comprehend how his discarded, supposedly broke ex-wife had bypassed a tactical security perimeter to sit in his mother's living room. His fragile ego instantly went into overdrive, desperately constructing a fictional narrative that protected his delusions of grandeur. He convinced himself that Aisha had secretly let me inside as a cruel, vindictive prank to humiliate him during his darkest hour. "What the hell are you doing in my mother's chair?" Preston roared, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. He stomped across the expensive Persian rug, his face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. "Get out! Get out of this house right now! You are just a bitter, pathetic ex-wife trying to stalk me because you cannot handle the fact that I moved on." Sylvia quickly recovered from her shock and joined his hysterical tirade. The sight of me sitting in her prized antique chair pushed her over the edge. Her desperate need to assert dominance over a woman she deemed socially inferior flared up one final time. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, her voice shrill and commanding. "How dare you break into my home and soil my furniture? You absolute nobody. You do not belong in this zip code, let alone in my living room. I am calling the police this very instant and having you arrested for breaking and entering." Preston continued to scream, pacing frantically in front of the coffee table. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the dominant, arrogant executive persona that had already been completely destroyed hours ago. He shouted that I was insanely obsessed with him. He claimed I was having a severe psychotic break because Brittany had given him the legacy I never could. He demanded to know how much money I had scraped together to bribe Aisha to let me sneak through the back door. He threatened to have me thrown in a psychiatric ward, completely oblivious to the fact that armed corporate security was currently locking down the perimeter of the property on my direct orders. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or interrupt his pathetic, desperate tantrum. I simply sat there in the velvet chair and let him exhaust himself. I watched him flail and scream, completely stripped of his corporate armor, reduced to nothing more than a cornered, fraudulent thief throwing a tantrum in a house he no longer owned. This was the man who had stood on a rooftop and humiliated me in front of 50 people. Now he was sweating through his ruined suit, entirely powerless. When Preston finally ran out of breath, he stood panting in the center of the room, glaring at me with bloodshot, exhausted eyes. He pointed toward the grand foyer, demanding I stand up and walk out the front door immediately before he physically dragged me out himself. I slowly uncrossed my legs. I did not stand up. I kept my gaze locked directly on his sweating, flushed face. I raised my right hand and clicked a small button on the side of my sleek silver pen. A bright, sharp red laser pointer illuminated from the tip, cutting through the space between us. I lowered my hand and directed the red dot onto the heavy glass coffee table situated right in front of my chair. Resting perfectly in the center of the polished glass was a stack of crisp legal documents. The top page featured the bright red expedited seals of the state Supreme Court. Right next to it was the original notarized deed to the historic Manhattan estate, prominently displaying the forged signature Preston had submitted to my shadow company. I kept the red laser hovering directly over the bold print of the final foreclosure notice. I looked Preston dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a cold, surgical, and absolutely merciless pitch. I am not trespassing, Preston. I am inspecting my new real estate. The silence in the grand living room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, heavy breathing of my former husband. Preston stared at the legal documents resting on the glass coffee table, his eyes locked onto the bright red seals of the state Supreme Court. For a fleeting second, I saw the truth try to force its way into his brain. But his massive, fragile ego slammed the door shut. He simply could not accept that the quiet woman he had discarded was currently holding the executioner's axe. Preston threw his head back and let out another jagged, hysterical bark of laughter. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, his features contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged denial. "You are completely insane," Preston shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You actually printed out fake legal documents just to stage some psychotic revenge fantasy. You are nothing but a bitter, poor ex-wife trying to stalk me, because you cannot accept that I chose a better woman. You make $150,000 a year, Vanessa. You could not even afford the property taxes on this estate, let alone buy it from a hedge fund." He frantically dug into the pocket of his ruined, stained suit trousers and pulled out his smartphone. He held it up like a weapon, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. "I am calling the police right now." Preston spat spit flying from his lips. "I am having you arrested for breaking and entering harassment and forging legal documents. You are going to a federal prison, Vanessa. I am going to make sure you rot in a cell for this pathetic little stunt." I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still in the velvet armchair, my posture relaxed, watching him punch the numbers into his phone screen. "You do not have a single dime to your name," Preston ranted, pacing wildly in front of the coffee table. "You are a sterile, boring calculator who rented a couple of security guards for the afternoon to try and scare me. Well, it is not working. Get out of my mother's house before I physically drag you out by your hair." Driven by a surge of desperate adrenaline-fueled rage, Preston lunged forward. He closed the distance between the coffee table and my chair in a split second, reaching out his large hand to physically grab my arm and yank me out of the antique seat. He never even made contact. Aisha stepped forward with blinding speed, her emerald green designer suit flashing in his peripheral vision. But it was the lead security contractor who moved first. The massive man in the tactical black suit intercepted Preston effortlessly. He planted a heavy, immovable hand directly onto the center of Preston's chest, shoving him backward with enough force to send him stumbling over the edge of the Persian rug. Preston hit the hardwood floor hard, his phone skidding across the polished wood. The other security guards instantly tightened their perimeter around my chair. Their hands rested firmly on their utility belts, their postures broadcasting a silent, lethal warning. "If you so much as breathe in her direction again, Preston," Isha said, her voice a sharp, terrifying blade of corporate authority, "you will not leave this property in a police cruiser. You will leave in an ambulance." Assaulting the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution carries consequences you cannot even begin to comprehend. Preston scrambled to his feet, holding his bruised shoulder, completely bewildered by the sheer, terrifying force of the security team's response. He opened his mouth to scream another insult, but a sudden strangled gasp cut through the tension in the room. It was Sylvia. While Preston had been throwing his hysterical tantrum, Sylvia had not been watching him. She had been staring intensely at the glass coffee table. Sylvia was a creature of high society, a woman who had spent her entire adult life studying the exact symbols, signatures, and markers of true wealth. Her eyes were locked onto the thick stack of foreclosure documents. She recognized the heavy watermarked legal paper. She recognized the authentic raised platinum seals of the Manhattan Banking Authority. But more importantly, she recognized the corporate logo embossed at the very top of the seizure notice, V Holdings. Sylvia's gaze slowly traveled from the legal documents on the table up to my face. Her breathing grew incredibly shallow. Her eyes darted down to my hands resting calmly on the arms of the velvet chair. She took in the impeccable razor-sharp cut of my midnight blue tailored suit, recognizing the bespoke stitching that cost more than a luxury vehicle. Then her eyes landed on my left wrist. I was wearing a custom platinum Patek Philippe timepiece. It was a watch explicitly unavailable to the general public. It could not be purchased in a store no matter how much money a person possessed. It was an ultra-rare invitation-only piece reserved exclusively for the absolute highest echelon of global billionaires. Sylvia knew this. She had seen a feature on that exact timepiece in an elite wealth management magazine. She knew that the piece of metal resting quietly on my wrist was worth significantly more than her entire heavily mortgaged historic estate. The final devastating piece of the puzzle slammed into Sylvia's mind with the force of a freight train. She looked at the corporate logo again. V Holdings. V for Vanessa. The color completely and utterly drained from Sylvia's meticulously contoured face. Her skin turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. The heavy cashmere shawl slipped off her shoulders, pooling silently on the hardwood floor. She began to tremble, a deep, violent shaking that started in her hands and quickly consumed her entire body. Mother Preston demanded, turning to look at her, oblivious to her internal collapse. "Tell this diversity hire lawyer and this crazy woman to get out of our house. Tell them we are calling the authorities." Sylvia did not respond to him. The absolute reality of her son's catastrophic mistake had finally shattered her entire world. The woman who had shoved a $10,000 check against my chest and called me a middle-class nobody was currently realizing that she had insulted the very billionaire who now owned her bloodline. Sylvia's knees simply gave out. She collapsed. She hit the floor hard, dropping to her knees right at the edge of the expensive Persian rug. Her manicured hands pressed against the floorboards as if trying to keep the room from spinning out of control. Preston rushed toward her, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. "Mom, what are you doing? Get up!" Sylvia looked up at her golden child, her face twisted in absolute paralyzing terror and pure horror. She looked at the man who had just traded away a billionaire wife for a gold-digging mistress who abandoned him in a motel. "Preston, you absolute fool!" Sylvia whispered, her voice cracking with sheer devastation. She slowly turned her head, her terrified wide eyes locking directly onto me. She looked at the bespoke suit, the priceless watch, and the wall of armed security guards protecting my chair. Sylvia's voice shook violently as she spoke the undeniable truth out loud. "The boy did not tell you." Sylvia gasped, struggling to pull air into her lungs. "She is not an employee. She is V Holdings. She bought our entire bloodline." The heavy floral-scented air of the living room turned completely stagnant. Sylvia's horrifying realization hung over the space like a physical weight. "She is V Holdings. She bought our entire bloodline." Preston stared at his mother, his jaw unhinged. His eyes darted from Sylvia's pale, terrified face back to me. He looked at the thick stack of foreclosure documents resting on the glass coffee table, analyzing the bright red seals of the state Supreme Court. He looked at the wall of armed corporate security guards protecting my chair. Finally, his gaze locked onto the ultra-rare invitation-only platinum timepiece resting quietly on my wrist. The massive, impenetrable wall of his ego completely fractured. The reality of what he had done crashed down on him with the devastating force of a collapsing building. He had not just cheated on a mid-level risk assessor. He had systematically betrayed, humiliated, and attempted to discard a billionaire chief executive officer who possessed enough capital to buy and sell his entire existence before breakfast. All the color drained from Preston's face. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling under the sheer weight of his catastrophic failure. He hit the hardwood floor, collapsing right next to his weeping mother. The arrogant, posturing Wall Street director was entirely gone. He was reduced to a hyperventilating, pathetic mess, kneeling on his mother's antique Persian rug. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic pleading. He raised his hands, palms open completely, forgetting the fact that just 3 minutes ago, he had threatened to have me thrown in a federal prison. He immediately shifted tactics, attempting the exact same emotional manipulation he had tried at my decoy apartment in Brooklyn. "Vanessa, please!" Preston stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "You have to listen to me. I was completely out of my mind. Brittany manipulated me. She preyed on my corporate stress. She convinced me to take out that internal loan. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just overwhelmed. You know me, Vanessa. We spent 10 years together. I have always loved you. I was just lost." He practically crawled forward, desperate to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. The lead security guard instantly stepped between us, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt, forcing Preston to cower back down onto the rug. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of sympathy or residual affection. I slowly stood up from the velvet armchair, smoothing the crisp fabric of my midnight blue blazer. I towered over both of them, looking down at the ruins of the family that had spent a decade treating me like an unwanted burden. "You wanted a woman who matched your ambition, Preston," I said, my voice echoing coldly off the vaulted ceilings. "You stood on a rooftop in front of 50 people and declared you needed a real family. You got exactly what you asked for. You got a ruthless, calculated gold digger, and the second your credit cards declined, she left you rotting in a filthy Queens motel." I turned my gaze to Sylvia, who was sobbing quietly into her hands, completely shattered by the loss of her precious social standing. "And you wanted a superior bloodline, Sylvia?" I continued, my tone absolutely merciless. "You wanted a legacy built on old money and elite zip codes. You demanded a daughter-in-law who fit your arrogant, racist, and pathetic societal standards. Now your historic estate belongs to me. Your bank accounts are frozen, and your grand legacy is exactly zero." Preston buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob. He begged me to call off the foreclosure. He promised he would sign whatever documents I wanted, swear whatever oaths I demanded if I just gave him one more chance to fix his massive mistakes. He pleaded with me to remember the vows we took, hypocritically weaponizing the very marriage he had so casually destroyed. He claimed he was ready to be a loyal husband, offering to abandon Brittany entirely if I would just restore his corporate credit lines. I looked at him with absolute disgust. "You wanted a legacy, Preston. You have it crying in a motel room right now. I highly suggest you figure out how to buy formula without a black card, because the sterile calculator is no longer funding your delusions." The heavy, desperate silence of the living room was abruptly shattered by the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens. The sound cut through the quiet Manhattan neighborhood, growing louder and more urgent by the second. Flashing red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the towering front windows of the estate, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the priceless oil paintings and the marble fireplace. Preston snapped his head up, a sudden delusional spark of hope lighting up his bloodshot eyes. He looked at the heavy mahogany front doors, genuinely believing that his mother's wealthy neighbors had heard the commotion and called the local authorities to report a disturbance. He thought the police were arriving to escort me and my private security team off the premises. He thought his elite status was finally going to save him from my corporate execution. Thank God, Preston gasped, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he scrambled to his feet. You went too far, Vanessa. You cannot just hold us hostage in our own home. The police are here. You are going to have to explain this illegal siege to the authorities, and I will press every charge available. Aisha stepped forward from the shadows of the foyer. Her emerald green designer suit caught the flashing police lights streaming through the glass. She looked down at her former brother-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated, professional satisfaction. She adjusted her leather briefcase and offered him a razor-sharp smile. They are not here for trespassing, Preston, Aisha said, her voice ringing with absolute undeniable finality. The heavy mahogany front doors swung open, pushed wide by the estate's private security team. 4 uniformed officers from the New York Police Department Financial Crimes Unit marched directly into the grand foyer, their hands resting on their duty belts. Their expressions were stern, their focus entirely locked onto the sweating, disheveled man standing by the coffee table. Aisha looked directly into Preston's terrified eyes and delivered the ultimate killing blow. I called them 30 minutes ago. They are here with a federal warrant for your arrest for corporate embezzlement and aggravated wire fraud. The 4 uniformed officers from the Financial Crimes Unit did not hesitate for a single second. They moved swiftly past the glass coffee table, completely ignoring the scattered foreclosure documents, and grabbed Preston firmly by his arms. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings of the grand living room. Preston did not fight back. The fight had been completely and utterly drained out of him. He went entirely limp, his shoulders sagging in absolute defeat as the officers read him his Miranda rights in a flat, clinical tone. He looked back at me one last time as they dragged him toward the mahogany front doors. His eyes were entirely hollow. He finally understood that he had orchestrated his own absolute destruction. In the corner of the grand living room, the newborn twins began to cry in their plastic carriers. The loud, piercing sound broke the tense silence. Sylvia looked at the infants, then looked at Aisha, her voice trembling violently as she asked what was going to happen to her grandchildren. Aisha adjusted her designer suit and looked at her former mother-in-law with absolute professional indifference. Child Protective Services is pulling through the front gates right now, Sylvia. I called them when Preston's arrest warrant was confirmed. Brittany completely blocked Preston's phone number and turned her phone off. She abandoned them at a motel, and now she is refusing to claim them. The state will take custody until a suitable guardian can be located. Sylvia let out a pathetic, broken sob. She looked around her prized living room, her eyes desperately clinging to the original oil paintings and the antique furniture she had spent decades showing off to her wealthy friends. She took a step toward a silver decorative bowl resting on a side table, intending to take it with her. My security chief stepped immediately into her path. He handed her a single standard-sized black canvas suitcase. You have exactly 5 minutes to pack your personal clothing, he instructed her. Every piece of furniture, jewelry, and art in this estate is now the legal property of V Holdings. If you attempt to remove a single asset, you will be joining your son in a police cruiser. Sylvia did not argue. She took the empty suitcase with shaking hands. 10 minutes later, the woman who had considered herself Manhattan royalty was escorted out the front door by armed guards. She walked slowly down the long stone driveway, pulling a single rolling bag behind her. The heavy iron gates slammed shut and padlocked securely the exact second she stepped onto the public sidewalk. 6 months passed. The transition was incredibly smooth, unhindered by the useless emotional weight I had carried for the last 10 years. Preston did not even make it to a trial. Confronted with the absolute mountain of digital evidence Aisha had meticulously compiled, his public defender strongly advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement and aggravated wire fraud. He traded his custom Italian suits for a standard issue khaki jumpsuit. He lost his freedom, his reputation, and his entire future because his massive ego demanded a lifestyle he could not afford. Sylvia was completely excommunicated from the elite Manhattan society she loved so much. When her wealthy friends realized she was utterly broke and her son was a convicted felon, they dropped her instantly. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped, rent-controlled apartment in the deepest part of the outer boroughs. She spends her days sitting in a dingy living room, surrounded by cheap furniture, completely isolated from the luxurious world she once ruled with an iron fist. Brittany's grand exit strategy failed spectacularly. She thought she could simply walk away from Preston and find a new billionaire to fund her life. Instead, my legal team hit her with a massive civil lawsuit. We sued her for the receipt of stolen corporate funds. The luxury car, the designer clothes, and the expensive hospital bills were all paid for with the money Preston embezzled. She is currently drowning in insurmountable legal debt, her wages are heavily garnished, and her social climbing days are permanently over. A distant cousin eventually took custody of the twins, sparing them from the toxic influence of the parents who saw them as nothing more than leverage. I stood on the expansive private rooftop terrace of my glass skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. The evening wind was crisp, carrying the electric energy of the city far below. The sun was just beginning to set, casting brilliant shades of gold and crimson across the towering skyline. I leaned against the heavy glass railing, looking out over the empire I had quietly built from the ground up. The door to the rooftop terrace opened smoothly. Aisha walked out, her heels clicking softly against the polished stone tiles. She was wearing a flawless crimson suit, looking every bit the absolute powerhouse she truly was. She carried 2 crystal flutes and a bottle of premium vintage champagne. She handed me a glass and poured the bubbling liquid, the sound bright and celebratory in the quiet evening air. To new beginnings, Aisha said, raising her glass with a sharp, victorious smile. To the new chief legal officer of V Holdings, I replied, tapping my crystal flute against hers. We drank the champagne standing side by side as absolute equals. We had both been severely underestimated by a family that valued superficial status over genuine substance. They thought they could step on us, exploit our resources, and discard us whenever it suited their arrogant narrative. They were completely wrong. I looked out over the glowing city lights. I did not just survive my husband's horrific betrayal, I weaponized it. I took the absolute worst moment of my personal life and turned it into the ultimate corporate acquisition. I stripped them of their power, exposed their lies, and built a stronger, infinitely more profitable future from the ashes of their greed. The ultimate lesson I learned is simple but devastatingly effective. Arrogant people will always dig their own graves if you just hand them the shovel. Never underestimate the woman who stays perfectly quiet while you do the digging. Have you ever had to let someone's arrogance be their ultimate downfall? How did you handle being underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you? Share your stories and experiences in the comments below. If this journey of corporate justice and absolute revenge resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about women who refuse to be victims. Thank you for listening to my story, and always remember your worth is entirely defined by you. The greatest lesson from this ordeal is that true power never needs to announce its presence. Arrogance is a fragile armor, and ego often blinds toxic individuals to the traps they eagerly dig for themselves. When faced with absolute betrayal, the immediate human instinct is to scream and demand loud justice. However, true strength lies in strategic silence. Let manipulative people underestimate you and believe they have won. By removing raw emotion from the equation, you can clearly dismantle the weaknesses in their lives. Have you ever let someone's arrogance be their ultimate downfall? Let me know in the comments below.